In March 2026, a Japanese man was sentenced to 20 years in prison in New York. So far, so good, this has happened more than once. But the absurd reason for this imprisonment is what makes this story different from anything you've ever heard. He was arrested for trying to sell plutonium to Iran. And the funniest part of this situation is that he was trying to sell the plutonium along with other drugs, as if it were some kind of delivery service. You order an illegal product, and you get nuclear material as a bonus. This story alone would be enough to make an entire video here. It's so absurd. But it made me think of something even bigger. This guy is not the first. Throughout history, especially when talking about Japanese people, there are cases so absurd and so hard to believe that if there were no proof, you'd think someone made it up. People who, out of greed, stubbornness, or even sheer incompetence, nearly changed the future of the world. And that's what we're going to see today in this video. I'm going to tell you about this case of the Japanese man who almost caused a world war, and I'm also going to show you other moments when the world was on the brink because of people like him. Let's start right from the beginning. Tekashi Ebisawa is introduced in the documents as a leader of the Yakuza, the Japanese mafia. He was supposedly involved in selling illegal goods, money laundering, that classic action movie villain profile. But there's a rather funny detail here. Researchers who investigated his story say he was probably just a fraud, a con artist. You can already tell from the start that this story doesn't make much sense. The American police started investigating him in 2019. For 3 years, an undercover agent infiltrated his network, pretending to be someone interested in the products he was selling. And without Ebisawa knowing, he was already introducing an agent to everyone in his international network. And this network was quite large, reaching from Japan to Thailand, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and the United States. He sold everything, from military arsenal, some of which were even stolen from the Americans, and there was a bit of everything in that catalog. At a certain point, you find plutonium. Ebisawa was introduced to another undercover agent. This one played the role of an Iranian general responsible for Iran's nuclear program. And Ebisawa, without batting an eye, trusted them and started negotiating the sale of weapons-grade uranium and plutonium. When the fake general asked if the uranium was of good quality, Ebisawa replied, "Yeah, I think so. I hope so." In other words, the guy had no idea what he was selling, but he kept selling it. And the worst part was that the samples were real. An American laboratory confirmed that the material contained actual weapons-grade plutonium. And to this day, no one knows exactly where he got it from. In 2022, he was arrested in New York, along with 3 Thai associates. And in March of this year, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. And that's how the story ends of a man who almost sold the end of the world to an Iranian agent who was actually an undercover American. All of this just by mistake. The guy really hadn't thought about the consequences of this. Now let me tell you this other absurd story. In December 1944, Lieutenant Hiru Onota was sent to Lubang Island in the Philippines. The mission was to conduct guerrilla operations and hinder the Allied advance. At that time, it's worth remembering that Japan was still at war with other countries. The commander's order was very clear: never surrender. Fight until we come back for you. Except that the war ended in 1945, and Onota wasn't notified. Or rather, he was notified several times, but he chose not to believe it. Planes dropped leaflets announcing Japan's surrender. Onota examined each one and found what he believed to be formulation errors, concluding that it was all enemy propaganda. Letters from the soldiers' own families were dropped from planes, and he thought they were traps. In 1952, the emperor himself sent a personal message, and still, Onota did not believe it. Meanwhile, he continued in the jungle, attacking farms, stealing cattle, and shooting at local civilians whom he thought were the enemy. His comrades died or surrendered over the years, one by one, until he was completely alone in 1972. The solution to finding him came from where he least expected. In 1974, a young Japanese man named Norio Suzuki decided to travel the world in search of 3 things: Lieutenant Onota, a giant panda, and the Yeti in that order. This young man was not a soldier. He had no training, no plan. He simply went to the jungle of Lubang and started shouting Onota's name, and he managed to find him in 4 days. But even then, do you think Onota surrendered? You're wrong. He said he would only obey a direct order from his commander. Suzuki returned to Japan, located Onota's former commander, who by that point owned a bookstore, and brought him back to the island. In March 1974, the ex-commander entered the jungle, found Onota, and gave the order. The war was over. He could lay down his arms. Onota handed over his rifle, grenades, sword, and a dagger that his mother had given him back in '44. The rifle was still in perfect working order. He had kept the equipment impeccable during almost 30 years in the jungle. He returned to Japan and was received as a national hero. At least there's that, right? Takeo Yoshikawa, the spy who worked too hard for nothing. December 7th, 1941. Japan attacks the American naval base in Hawaii and drags the United States into World War II, one of the greatest strategic turnarounds of the century. This operation was made possible in part thanks to the work of a spy named Takeo Yoshikawa. Yoshikawa arrived in Hawaii in March '41 with an apparently false identity. He introduced himself as Tadashi Morimura, the vice consul of the Japanese consulate in Honolulu. In practice, he was a naval intelligence officer with a single mission. He had to map everything about the American fleet in that region, and he was incredibly dedicated. He rented an apartment overlooking the base, strolled around the island making mental notes, never carrying paper or a camera to avoid raising suspicion. He would drink tea at a Japanese tea house located on top of a hill that overlooked the harbor. He rented small planes, flew over military installations under the guise of a tourist, and one night he entered the waters of Pearl Harbor with a bamboo snorkel to breathe and tried to examine the underwater barriers from below, emerging covered in scratches and achieving practically nothing. He telegraphed Tokyo saying he had only found confusing details. He was a man who was truly giving it his all. For months, he sent detailed reports to Tokyo, with ship positions, patrol routes, absence of aircraft carriers at the base, information that was directly used in planning the attack. There's just one detail I forgot to mention to you. The code he used to communicate this information, the so-called Purple Code, had already been discovered and deciphered by the Americans, and for a long time. Communications between the consulate and Tokyo were already being monitored and read in Washington, while Yoshikawa sent each report. The Americans knew there was an active spy in Pearl Harbor. They knew he was monitoring everything. In fact, they had come close to identifying him, because the name Tadashi Morimura simply did not exist in the Japanese registry. Moreover, the man was clearly too young for the position he claimed to hold. And then the attack happened. Yoshikawa destroyed all the evidence and documents he had before being arrested by the FBI. And since they couldn't prove anything, he was returned to Japan in a diplomatic exchange in '42. The Americans never discovered that he was the main Japanese spy in Hawaii. The man spent the rest of his life as a gas station owner, with little to no official recognition. And the end result was that he worked for months, dove into salt water at night with a pipe in his mouth, flew over bases, did everything, sent codes. And in the end, his work was absolutely useless. The Japanese execution did not follow his information very correctly. But now, imagine the damage that would have been done if the Americans hadn't known about it. Anyway, I have many other stories like this one. If you like this different format we're testing, comment below. Let me know what you think. Do you also like history? Learning more about the past? Leave your comment here. I'll be talking with you and responding to the comments. A con artist who sold himself as a yakuza and nearly put a weapon in Iran's hands. A soldier who stayed in the jungle for 30 years because no one could convince him the war was over. A spy who did everything and in the end, his work was not very useful. The world has often been in very questionable hands, and it survived not because of the competence of those involved, but because of the luck they had. Thank you very much for watching up to here.